This is the PowerPoint on interacting with journals. So we'll start out talking about some common errors in writing for journals. In that chapter they talk about this idea of the born writer, and Henson talks about that he thinks that on every campus there is a born writer who is able to crank out articles at will, and I don't know, I think that's certainly something of a myth. I couldn't name anybody like that on my campus or in my department. There's certainly lots of people who write. I think the thing to keep in mind about colleges and universities is that they are collections of people who are writers to some degree. You've heard the phrase publish or perish before, and that has to do with how someone, a professor, might be tenured and then promoted over the course of a career, and part of the way to distinguish oneself is through publication. But actually what writing is it's hard work. You know, you have to learn the craft. You have to learn how to be a good writer first, and then you have to learn how your type of writing fits into a larger scope of scholarship if you're working in academics. If you're working in other fields where writing may be important, such as journalism, first you have to learn how to write, and to write well, and then you have to learn how to be a good newspaper reporter or a magazine writer or a magazine editor or whatever. And it simply takes work. Something that our culture does is it does seem to encourage this idea of the born writer. You know, for example, perhaps in high school in a literature class, we may learn that Samuel Taylor Coleridge wrote the opening lines of the poem Kubla Khan, and then went out and did something else and forgot the rest of them. And so we have this idea that writing strikes us in moments of genius or epiphany, but mostly it's just hard work. It's, 90% perspiration and 10% inspiration. So some of the other problems that Henson writes about are the lack of familiarity with the journal. Before you submit something, you need to be familiar with it. You need to have read more than one issue of the journal. You need to pay attention to what seem to be the standards for documentation. He makes the comment that he would think that an article could be rejected because it was using the wrong style of documentation. And perhaps that's true in his field, where APA is probably the most common style of documentation used. In my field, I know editors are a little bit looser because some people do use MLA, some people do use APA. Some journals require their own specific style of documentation, a kind of a numbered style. That's something that's explained in the Chicago Manual of Style. And so they are more open to getting different styles of documentation, but usually what they want is they want all of the articles to conform to one particular style. That is, you could submit an article written in APA to a technical communication journal, and if they accept it, they would want you to revise it and to put it into if they had a numbered style, for example, they would want you to put it into that particular format. Now, of course, with other types of journals, documentation is less formal, but yet there is a clear attribution of quotes and things like that, being very clear about who said what and where you got your information from. That's often done more informally in other types of writing. But still, it's important to keep in mind that people want to know where information came from. That's true in the workplace, too, as well. Nobody's interested in the first 12 hits that you got on a topic from Google. Anybody can do that. People want to see better informed information or from better informed sources. And the way that you indicate that is by having a works cited list and connection between it and the text in the form of documentation in a standard format and not a made-up one. Now, with journals, very often something that you need to be looking for is the instructions for submissions, and sometimes you'll find this actually in the journal itself. It might be on a back page or something like that, and usually it will be an entire page. And this is true with popular journals as well. So, very often, what you can do these days is go to the website for the journal. And for example, with this particular journal, this is one that I was on fairly recently when I was working on a book review for this journal. And you can see that there's a tab there for Submit Paper. And when you click on it, you see that it has just a lot of different information, about, to start with, the types of articles that they're interested in. Some that they call article length studies, and then versus approaches and practices, which are shorter pieces. You can see that they're giving you a word count, and that's pretty typical in the publishing world to work with a word count. And the reason for that is that when an article is going to be published in a journal, it's going to be published according to a certain font that the journal uses and a certain size to that font. And that's, you're used to looking at that with whatever the default is on your computer, on your word processor, and then there's a number next to that indicating the size of the font. And as you may know, generally you want to work somewhere between 9 and 15 for a size for a font. 12 is probably a good standard. But the reason they give you a word count is they know the font they're going to use, they know the size that it's going to be, and so by giving you a word count and by seeing how long your article is in that regard, then they know how much space it's going to take in terms of planning for the layout and the design of the document. And they'll have a formula that they can use. They'll say, oh, well, this 9,000 word article is going to equal X number of column inches in the journal. And so you can see they have others for submitting the other types of writing, such as book reviews and comments and responses, which are even shorter. And then more general information about submitting manuscripts. Something that's become pretty common is they give you a link there for someone who wanted to submit to this journal to click on, and then you go through a process of uploading your article to their site. And this is very much decreased the response time, so that you get a response to your article a lot more quickly, because you're not having to put things in the postal mail and then wait for it to come back. But in terms of uploading, generally they specify what type of form the document should be in, and you need to pay attention to that. Generally, Word files are okay, though PDFs are preferred because they're really better for you to use, because they're more stable and less likely to spread viruses around and things like that. You notice here that they're recommending the American Psychological Association for style. There are other types of instructions about uploading figures separately and all that sort of thing. I think that's kind of left over from using hard copy printed materials, because these days you can just take your image and insert it directly into your article, and then they can likewise use the same image and just insert it into the article. But it's always best to follow instructions like these that you may have access to. Here's some more. They describe the peer review process. A lot of popular journals don't use the peer review process. You submit it to an editor who reads it and decides whether or not to publish it, or it may go to readers who read all the articles and then make recommendations to the editor, who makes a final decision. But academic publishing generally goes through what they refer to as a blind review. That is, the reviewers don't know whose work they're reading, and they have some instructions there too about how to refer to your own work, which seems a little odd to me, because I've had other journals that will say, well, what you do is you refer to your own work in the third person. So, as if you were someone else writing about you. And then when you change it, you can, or I have shifted to the first person myself when making a reference to some of my own work in an article. So. And it's always, you should pay strict attention. They give you down here, for example, the order in which the parts of the article should be submitted: title page, abstract, keywords, text, notes, and so forth. Always do that exactly the way that you're asked to do it. Because the thing, Henson talks about, a lot of people see start to see the editor pretty quickly as an adversary. But really they're not. I mean, they're looking for good work to publish, and they what you want to do though is to try to get them to have to do as little work as possible on your article, and that's not only the writing but also how everything else is submitted, so that they don't have to do anything. They just have to read it and then pass it along to the printer. That's what you're striving for. That is, no changes made to your article. Now, it very well may be that you get your article sent back to you and you may be asked to make changes of some sort. That's fine. You should, I would certainly encourage anyone who gets a piece sent back, and I've had pieces sent back with suggestions for revision. My book was certainly sent back with a 6-page single-space letter on suggestions for revision, and it was positive. It was constructive. I can't say every comment I've had on my work has been constructive, but more often than not, suggestions for revision are constructive and help it to become a better document. But I would definitely recommend that you take the advice and work through it, and then resubmit and see if you can get your work accepted afterwards. That certainly doesn't mean that you failed when you're asked to revise and resubmit. And you can see here that they talk and mention the length of the abstract, which is going to be a descriptive abstract that is simply describe what is in the article. And they talk or mention using headings and subheadings too as well. And level headings 1 should be centered, boldface, and so forth. Level 2 headings should be flush left. I've got an example coming up of that I'll show you, of the use of headings, because the author mentions it later on in the chapter. And they have a little bit. They've done some summarizing of APA. Most journals don't do this, but this is to help the authors with some of the basic or perhaps some problem instances, like how to use personal communications and things like that. To incorporate them in an article and to document them correctly. And here's some more information on that. And even with little things like using the ampersand instead of the word and, you want to pay attention to all that. Italicizing the title of the book, titles of journals, titles of web documents. Your goal should be for the editor to do as little as possible, preferably nothing, to your article. Okay, so to continue, of course, you want to proofread. I mean, grammar is not taught nearly as much or as well as it should be in our public schools, and it's not typically taught much or at all in college either, because it's assumed that students have a grasp of basic grammar by the time they get to college, and yet it's something that people complain about. Editors complain about, professors in other disciplines complain about, and so it's good to proofread. Certainly something that I do to help me to catch error is I'll switch mediums, and What I mean by that is, if I'm working electronically, on a word processor writing, before I submit something, I'll print it out and then proofread the printed out copy, and invariably I'll catch mistakes when I do that. Or sometimes if you're working on something on print, you can switch back to the electronic version, and that helps you just to see your work differently. Henson makes suggestions for things that are also a good idea, like to get other people to read it for you, to put it aside for a day or so and then come back later. Some other problems he notes are failure to include substance. He talks about this research versus non-research journals, and this is in education. A non-research journal would be a journal that would focus more on people making suggestions on how on classroom activities, how teaching can take place in a better way, and so forth, versus research where someone has actually done research, like for example studied something, a phenomenon in a classroom, and perhaps set up some type of experimental methodology and then is now reporting on it. So something else that is mentioned in this instance is the idea of an acceptance rate for journals, and that's something that you can query query an editor about by simply sending that person an email. We'll talk more in a minute about contacting editors. Under the failure to write simply and clearly, of course, there's a lot. Henson talks a lot about conciseness, and that's certainly important. That's something that you'll struggle with all your lives as writers, trying to, what comes out on the page is often a reflection of our internal struggles to get it there, to get it out on the page or on the screen. And then what we're doing when we're editing is trying to clarify what's there. It may be grammatically correct, stylistically correct, except for excessively wordy, but that's something we're very often trying to dig through, to use one word to take the place of three or four. So conciseness is certainly important. Something else that he mentions in this area, which I alluded to a minute ago, was to using headings. And this is a screenshot of actually my first published article. This journal, at part of its instructions to writers, they ask people to use headings liberally. And so we have an example here of headings versus subheadings. A heading is in the left column, readability is liability. That's a heading, a level 1 heading. And then the ones on the right hand page, technical vocabulary, syllable counts, and technical writing and audience, these are subheadings. You can see that they've differentiated in terms of layout, with readability as liability is in all caps and it's centered, and then the subheadings are flush left and just the first letter in each word is capitalized. So, but using headings, that's is valuable in general, not just for journal writing, but for workplace writing in general, because it allows the reader to see the different parts of a document at a glance. You can also, with a report, using headings in a report, you can then use the headings to create a table of contents, so the readers can jump around more easily in the document and read the parts see which parts they need to read. So, but it does help in general with clarity. Okay, so themed issues, he also mentions that's not an error, really, in writing for journals. I thought it was unusual that he said that he was asked to do one as a graduate student. Usually that's something that you do when you have more experience. However, I can see a graduate student doing it, because graduate students are often studying with people who are experts in their field, and so they're learning about these different areas as well, and they may gain expertise in something that is very quickly something that is cutting edge, and that would make them a good person to be an editor of a themed issue. So it certainly isn't out of the question. It's just not something that happens very often. So it's a good idea to pay attention to your title. These are two of my titles. Of the two, the one that's better, I think, is the second one, because it is more specific in terms of the type of article that it is. It's a review essay. So, and a review essay is similar to a review of the literature, but it the writer enters into an argument, an area of argument, and becomes a voice in that argument. So, but it's very much like a review of the literature where you're summarizing what's been written on a particular topic. Henson also recommends that you focus on the opening paragraph. That's also good advice. I think that in general, journalistic writing is a better model for writing, most writing in general, than academic writing as it's taught. So much academic writing is taught on the inverted pyramid model, where the writer is supposed to start at some broad, universal point and then proceed down to the specific. Whereas journalism starts with the specific. You may have heard that the first sentence in a news article is called the lead and answers the 5 questions: who, what, when, where, and why, and sometimes how as well. And it's best to get to the point and to be clear what it is that you're going to discuss from the very beginning, and I think that's something that comes out in some of the examples that Henson uses. One of them, it isn't clear until like the 4th or 5th paragraph what the topic is of the article that this person is proposing to write, and it needs to be clear from the very beginning. A better way to think about it is by being clear from the very beginning. Then the rest of the piece, whether it's a letter that's a query letter or an introductory letter, or it's the article itself, can then support that clear objective. So communicating with journal editors, Henson says that it's okay to call. I would make sure that your editor is okay with that. I think these days what's considered to be better in terms of communicating with editors is an email. If they give you an email, that's the best way to do it, because it's just so much easier to respond to one in a variety of different situations. Might be at home or at a coffee shop or at your office even, and it's easier than trying to deal with telephone calls, which don't always come at convenient times, as we all know. And you are trying to develop a relationship with an editor, and the way that you do that is by getting them to publish your work. And you don't want to alienate them from the beginning by making unnecessary telephone calls. The thing about email is that it flattens the company hierarchy in general. This is something that was discovered pretty quickly when email became common for companies. They gave everybody an email, and that meant the president or CEO of the corporation had an email. And so that meant that anybody who had access to email could write that person. And of course, they've learned new ways to hide behind secretaries since then. Though it's still easier to get in touch with somebody like that through email. But I think in terms of working with editors or with agents, if that's something that you're interested in, it is easier to work with using email. So your first writing assignment here is going to be a letter of query or introduction, query letter, and I'm kind of broadening it a little bit so that you could have a couple of different instances. One, a letter of query or a query letter is when you want to write to someone to find out if they would like to, if they'd be interested in seeing something from you, an article or what have you. And this is most often the case with nonfiction work. A letter of introduction could be one that could accompany any type of writing. It could be an article, it could be a short story, or it could be a collection of poems. Usually when people submit poetry, they don't submit just one poem. They usually submit, like a half dozen or so. And that's a good way to do it, and you might even wind up with getting more than one poem published in a journal. That's what you're trying to do. Of course, it might just be one, but at least they have several to pick from. And so the acronym I've come up with for writing this query letter or letter of introduction is for you to be an ACE. And to be an ACE, you need to activate, convince, and effect. Okay, so the activate section is this is the introduction. This is that first sentence where you want to get to the point about what it is that you have to say. You're going to provide some basic relevant information in terms of what type of work it is that you're introducing or that you're querying about, some type of introduction to your work. And it should to some extent define your relationship with the editor. Are you a new person that they don't know? Are you someone who is established, who you're contacting them again with something new? You're someone they've published before, in other words. So the C stands for convince, and here you want to provide an article summary. Or if you were writing to submit some short stories, you might summarize what your story is about, or perhaps why you've written it. This section could be more than one paragraph. You should, of course, shift to a new paragraph whenever you shift your focus on the topic. And then you want to effect. What do you want your audience to do in response to your request? Do you want them to get back in touch with you about it? If you're mailing a letter through the postal system, and sometimes some editors may want you to do this, I think sometimes I wonder if it's set up that way to be an additional obstacle to overcome. But if the editor wants you to use the postal system, then you need to be sure to enclose a self-addressed stamped envelope, or no matter how much they like it, they may never get back in touch with you. If you're asking them to come up with their own envelope and put a stamp on it and address it, it just may not happen. There's a lot of competition. Of course, if you're using email, you don't have to worry about that, but you need to be clear about wanting a response. And I think most editors, if they're not interested, they'll let you know with an email, no thanks, or I've got all I can use right now, or whatever. So this is a query letter that I used recently to get the book review editor of the Journal of Business and Technical Communication interested in this review. I had read the book and I wanted to write a review of it because I thought other people would be interested in it. And you can see in the first sentence I cite the name of the article or the book and the author, its author. In the research area, I thought that it would especially interest, and I gave the review editor some idea of what Wooten does in this book. And then in the second paragraph, I go into more detail about that, about how his thesis is that there had to, for science to exist, words had to be coined to express it. words like experiment and fact, even law of nature, and even discover. So, and this was a query letter that was successful. As I said, this review is currently scheduled to be published early next year. Now, this is a letter of introduction for an article that I had written and was submitting to the Journal of Technical Writing and Communication. And you can see that I begin by with the name of the article in the first sentence, and that it's available for that editor's exclusive consideration. Sometimes I'll take a sentence like that and put it in the conclusion, but I put it in the introduction here. And then I put some, in the next paragraph, I talk about some of my background and my reasoning for writing this article. Why I was interested in this topic, and what specific reading that I did from a treatise that Aristotle wrote called The History of Animals, which is about different, basically it's about different animals. A lot about bumblebees in it, believe it or not, because the ancient Greeks liked honey so much, but there's also some passages about dolphins because they thought they were interesting, dolphins and whales. But I was interested in his use of metaphor, and that's something that's certainly relevant for scientific and technical communication. In the next to last paragraph, I talk about the relevance to current scholarship and teaching and so forth. And then you notice that the final paragraph gives a variety of contact information, including even my fax number, which I don't use very often. Now, with both of these letters, I make a note at the top of this one and at the top of the previous one, though I didn't say anything about it. If you're sending out a postal letter, then you need to be sure that you have your address at the top and then your audience's address. It's a good idea to have a date. Of course, you don't need all that with an email, though you'd be well advised in your signature to have contact information like that repeated, and also perhaps some indication of who you are if you're a student or a graduate student or what have you. And of course, if you use postal mail, you need to be sure to include a self-addressed stamped envelope. Questions? I'll see you online.